Have you ever imagined that buying your dream home could turn into a nightmare? In this upscale neighborhood, behind the old walls, lie terrifying secrets and stories no one dares to speak of. What happened to Mr. Omar's family on their very first night? And why does everyone look at them as if they've committed an unforgivable sin? Get ready to experience events that will make you question everything. Can you speak today, Mr. Omar? Screams and visions, indistinct whispers. I never imagined that things would eventually lead me to a room in a psychiatric hospital. No matter how much I tell you about what I saw, you won't believe me. Your mind simply cannot comprehend it, and you'll find 1,000 excuses not to. It all began when I returned to Morocco after 20 years in Germany. I decided to buy a new house in the city. The search was long and exhausting, especially since I wanted a high-end neighborhood with few residents. After speaking with many real estate agents and sifting through countless ads, I finally got a call. Mr. Omar, how are you? Good, thank you. Who's this? This is Fuad, the real estate agent. You contacted me earlier about a house in a quiet area near the city center. Yes, I remember. Well, I've found an excellent 2-story house. I've sent you pictures on WhatsApp if you'd like to take a look. We talked at length about the house. After discussing it with my wife, Basant, we decided to buy it. The price was very reasonable, and it matched what I had imagined. Within a week, everything was settled with the owner of the house, a polite elderly woman in her 70s who spoke very little. Her demeanor made me feel comfortable about the place. I moved into the new house with my entire family, my wife Basant and my 2 children, Hamza and Aliyah. During the move, I noticed something I didn't want to dwell on. Most of the neighbors were giving us strange, inexplicable looks. Sometimes I felt they were looks of annoyance or anger. Other times they seemed filled with pity or sympathy. No one approached us to introduce themselves or even greet us as we were settling in. Then on the last day of moving, a man in his 40s approached me, extending his hand for a handshake. I extended mine in return. I heard you're the new resident. I'm your neighbor, lawyer Hussein Farid. My house is directly across from yours. Very pleased to meet you. I thought it was a rule in this neighborhood that no one greets or acknowledges each other. I said this with a chuckle, sarcastically commenting on what I'd observed over the past week. He responded with a similar laugh and said, "Why would you say that, Mr. Omar? On the contrary, everyone in this compound knows each other." Really? I just felt a bit of curiosity from the residents, that's all. Didn't anyone tell you the story of the house before you bought it? The story? What story? I asked, raising my right eyebrow in confusion. Realizing he'd said too much, he stammered and invited me into his garden for a drink. It didn't take much convincing. I agreed on his second attempt because I was curious about what he meant. I stepped into his garden, which was spacious and had a calming atmosphere. He prepared some tea and began to speak. "I'm surprised Mrs. Fatima didn't tell you about the house." "What's wrong with the house, Mr. Hussein?" "It's a long story, Mr. Omar, but this house is the oldest in the compound. Or rather, the compound was built around it because the owner, Fatima, refused to sell it. I don't want to scare you or make you uneasy, but what's said about this house is far worse than what I'm going to tell you. This house used to belong to Fuad, a prominent figure in Morocco during the days of the monarchy and a close confidant of the king. He had 2 children, Fatima and Mohammed. Mohammed was his pride and joy. At the age of 14, he was about to be enrolled in a military academy. But overnight, everything changed. They say he was possessed by a demonic spirit. They tried everything to exorcise the spirit. His weight, which was reportedly 110 kilos, dropped to 40 kilos in just 20 days. His father was at a loss until one day they found him dead in his room. But the story didn't end there. Religious figures and spirit experts advised the family to leave the house, but Fuad refused. Exactly 1 week later, Fuad himself was possessed and died. The mother had no choice but to take her daughter Fatima and leave the house. Since then, it has been locked up, and people in the neighborhood avoid going near it. I can't deny that his words unsettled me, but I didn't believe in such superstitions. I thanked him and told him everything happens by God's will. However, when I returned to my new home, I looked at it differently. The walls were indeed old, the architecture ancient. My perspective had shifted. What comforted me was the excitement of my children and Basin's joy about the house. But if I could turn back time, I would have taken them and left. No, I would have run screaming from the horrors we were about to face. If you want to continue another time, I don't mind. No. Doctor, I'll keep going. On the first night, we woke up to a power outage. But that wasn't the strange part. The strange part was the noise coming from downstairs, loud enough to wake everyone in the house. I calmed the kids and went downstairs, lighting candles as I searched for the source of the sounds. It wasn't loud banging, but rather the sound of chairs and tables being moved. And after the house finally calmed down, a series of sudden, rhythmic knocks began on the bedroom doors. Even I was starting to feel genuinely afraid, but I forced myself to sleep. Barely. The 7th night. 6 nights had passed since that incident, to the point that I had almost forgotten about it. Everything seemed perfectly normal until it happened again in the middle of the night. The power went out. This time, I stayed in bed. I could hear the sound of chairs being moved downstairs, but I convinced myself to ignore it and sleep. Then, suddenly, someone started knocking on my bedroom door, hard and rhythmically. Thump, thump, thump. At that moment, my son Hamza ran into the room, panicked. If I hadn't shown my phone's flashlight on him before he reached me, I might have killed him out of fear. Dad, there are strange noises. Someone's walking on the stairs. I held him close, calmed him down, and put him back to sleep. But that night, I resolved that I had to leave this house. The only thing stopping me was that I had no other place to go, especially after spending so much money on it. The 15th night. In the nights that followed, nothing extraordinary happened, just the usual banging and the sound of chairs moving. It got to the point where the whole family became used to it, and even Alya no longer seemed afraid. But on the 15th night, we were watching TV downstairs when the power went out again. Total darkness enveloped us. Then the sound of chairs moving began again. My children moved closer to me, and my daughter, Zara, grabbed my hand tightly. Then we started hearing slow, deliberate footsteps on the staircase. Out of nowhere, Zara said something chilling. "Uncle climbing the stairs, do this." She clapped her hands 3 times. Immediately, the sound of 3 identical claps echoed back. Zara laughed innocently, but my wife Mariam and I were horrified. Suddenly, my son Hamza began convulsing violently. His body jerked unnaturally as he coughed, a wild, uncontrollable fit. Exactly 1 minute later, the power returned, and I saw his face. It was covered in blood from his coughing. Every cough brought more blood. The 17th night. Things were becoming truly terrifying. My son Hamza had changed. He was sleeping far too much and refused to leave the house. Every time I tried to take him to a doctor, he would collapse unconscious the moment we reached the front door. I called my neighbor, Mr. Hussein, and explained everything to him. "We need to bring in a religious healer," he said. "This has gone far beyond anything normal, Mr. Omar. What you're describing is serious." When the healer arrived, he was visibly uncomfortable. After completing his rituals with Hamza, he began inspecting the walls of the house. Finally, he turned to me and said, "You must leave this house, Mr. Omar. This place is cursed. It's unfit for anyone to live in." The 20th night, I woke up to the sound of my wife Mariam screaming. I turned on the light only to find that she wasn't beside me. Instead, she was standing in front of the mirror, cutting into her own skin. Her hair lay scattered all over the floor, completely chopped off. The sight was bone-chilling. I could only stammer out, "What's happening? What are you doing?" She turned to me, her face a horrifying blend of calmness and insanity, and said, "All of you will die here." The power went out again, and suddenly someone lunged at me, stabbing me with a knife. I woke up here in the hospital, my body covered in wounds. They told me I'd survived by some miracle, but everyone says that my wife Mariam killed our children and then took her own life. But believe me, my wife and children are still in that house. Their spirits haven't left. The doctor sighed. "I'm sorry, Mr. Omar, but I needed to hear your story directly from you, not just from your case file. I'll be continuing to monitor your condition." 10 years later, in the house's living room, "So, Mr. Omar, are you sure you won't lower the price? This is my final price. I can't go any lower." "Honestly, it's fair. The house is beautiful and reasonably priced. It's quite old, though." Omar glanced up at the staircase where the ghostly figure of his wife, Mariam, stood, smiling at him with a haunting expression. He smiled back at the buyer and said, "Yes, and the walls are vintage, classic, and elegant. Congratulations on your new home."